Good morning, campus family. Good to see you. Good to be back with you. This morning, we're continuing our journey through Paul's second letter to the church in Thessalonica. And as we do, we're coming to one of those passages in the Bible that has a bit of a reputation. Last week, Pastor Zach introduced this book to us, and he talked about what the day of the Lord is and how the early church understood it to mean the end of everything. It's the moment that Jesus would come back into power, that he would establish his kingdom, and it leads us right into chapter 2, which opens with a heading that has given a lot of people pause, because it says, "The Man of Lawlessness." And it's a title that even itself is a little ominous, eh? And so we're going to be hanging out here for the next 2 weeks and really spending some time unpacking what this means for us. But before we get to any of that end time or end of the world language, and before we talk about figures or timelines or theology around that, we're going to slow down and we're going to pay attention to something more basic and just speak pastorally for a moment about what's happening here in the text. Because it's really, really easy to read it and for our heart rate to start beating a little faster, right? And our pulse pounding in our ears. But it's also really important that we understand that this part of Paul's letter isn't written to stoke our anxiety or to stir our fears. And it wasn't actually even written to get us focused on the end times. It was written as a bit of a warning and as an encouragement, but also, and especially, to calm them. And I say that because I think we can all understand the kind of anxiety that exists in this passage. There's a principle out there called the missing information anxiety. And it's basically a principle that says whenever you're missing information, it will trigger anxiety and it will fill the gaps with imagined or worst case scenarios. You can think about it. If you go to the doctor's office because you're worried about something, until that test result comes back, it's easy to catastrophize. It's why never go to WebMD, right? And to be really practical, right? It's when, there's something that's either incomplete or some secondhand information. Could be something like a comment or a message that you've heard, a headline that you read, an update that you get without the information laid out. Whatever that is, what happens then is before we've had time to check it out, before we've had time to research it, think about it, get good wisdom on it, our minds have a tendency to race ahead and we start to fill in the blanks. And we don't fill them in with good things. We fill it in with our anxieties, with our fears, with our doubts. Our imaginations run ahead of reality, and pretty soon we can find ourselves carrying a weight that might be totally disconnected from the truth. What's wild about those moments, and I'm sure that we've all had them, is that usually nothing's changed. The situation hasn't shifted yet. The facts haven't been fully confirmed or fleshed out, right? Or verified. Internally, though, everything can feel different. And that experience, that sense of being unsettled before we've got the full picture, before we've had time to think, that's what's going on with the church in Thessalonica. Now, I don't want to be too hard on them, because I will admit it's easy to read this passage, and maybe you've done this before, but it's easy to read this passage and to assume that the Christians living here are confused and anxious because they're spiritually immature, or because they're naive, or they're sloppy with their theology. It's easy to make that assumption, but it actually has very little to do with that. They are definitely a young church, but they were also a deeply committed church. And they had endured a lot of persecution. And they'd managed to remain faithful under a lot of pressure from both the Roman authorities and even their own neighbors. And now if you were with us here last week and for Pastor Zach's message, you might remember that Paul actually commends them. He gives thanks for them. That's sort of a big part of the first chapter. He commends them for their perseverance, for their love for one another. They have a lot to celebrate. These were not a people casually coasting through their faith. And still, we see that they were shaken. And what makes this moment especially significant is not what they were afraid of, but why they were afraid. And Paul tells us that their anxiety isn't coming out of left field. It's fueled by claims that carried weight. There was what sounded like prophetic insight. There was authoritative teaching, something that sounded or appeared to be a letter written by either an apostle or by Paul himself. And so their fears had this veneer of credibility to it. They were being told that the day of the Lord has come. They were being told that something decisive has happened, that you've missed it. And if you let that sit with you for a minute, you can see why this would be really troubling. Right? Like, they're not sitting around a table in a comfortable living room or a coffee shop debating the end times or looking at end time charts or something like that or imagining timelines or what it's all going to look like 2,000 years later. This is happening in the moment, and there's an existential fear for them that's creating this frantic sense of urgency. They're sitting there wondering, have we misunderstood the gospel? Have we been left behind? Have we missed what God was doing? And that's what Paul is responding to. And I actually think it's really easy to see how this connects so directly with our own moment, because we are finding ourselves, we are in a moment right now where it can feel like the world is running away from us. We live in a moment, in a world of deep fakes and AI content. Who here scrolled through something, found something funny, only to realize that it's completely AI generated, like it never happened? Right? Like we live in this moment, right? And it's harder than ever to tell whether something is real or imagined or faked or created. And you add in that there are a lot of competing historical positions on a ton of theological issues. It's honestly no great mystery how solidly faithful believers today can end up feeling anxious or with a false sense of urgency. And so just like the Theselonians, a lot of what unsettles you and I doesn't come from obviously hostile sources. It often comes from voices that sound convincing. They sound informed. They sound maybe even spiritual. They're voices that speak with certainty and voices that imply that something is happening right now, like eyes up, right? Like, you got to pay attention because if we don't keep up, we're going to miss it. And that's why this passage matters so much, because Paul is not writing to a church that's abandoned Jesus. He's writing to a church that's faithful, they're sincere, they're committed, but they're also deeply shaken. And it should remind us that spiritual instability in our own lives isn't always immaturity or rebellion. Sometimes we have good desires, good intentions. We are pursuing honestly, and we're not being ruled by our fears, but we find ourselves in a moment where we can absolutely be slowly shaped or shaken by fears rather than our trust in God. And so let's see how Paul goes about actually intentionally slowing them down, and rather than shaming them for asking questions or indulging in their speculation, Paul calms them down. He reframes what they already know to be true, and he de-escalates their anxiety. And so we're going to open up, and if you have your Bible, why don't you open up with me to chapter 2 of 2 Thessalonians. Starting right at verse 1, he says, "Concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, do not become easily unsettled or alarmed by the teaching allegedly from us, whether by a prophecy or by a word of mouth or by letter." And so right after Paul opens with prayers and thanksgivings in chapter 1, he transitions into this. And rather than addressing the things that they've heard, Paul actually starts by naming what it's done to them. See what he says again. He says, "Do not become easily unsettled or alarmed." He's not diagnosing a theological problem yet. Paul is pointing out the emotional state of mind that they find themselves in. Remember, the problem isn't that they've stopped believing in Jesus, right? They are still just as committed as ever. It's that their confidence in what was supposed to happen has been shaken. And that's really important because it tells us something about how Paul understands faith. Now, we know from Paul's writings, we've got it in lots of different letters and writings, right? That we know what Paul believes about faith. And we understand that he values clear and good theology. We see in other places in Paul's writings where he actually pushes back really hard against any sort of wrong teaching. Any of this Jesus plus, or that you had to do this, or that you have to do that. He pushes back against that stuff. Anything that wanders from the gospel. But what's very clear from Paul's writing here is that Paul says faith is way more than just understanding it up here. It's that it needs to live in here. It needs to become that thing that roots us. When life feels fragile, it steadies us. It anchors us. It is our foundation. And so do you notice how Paul frames the issue? He doesn't start by saying, you're wrong. He might do that in another letter. If there was really rampant bad theology somewhere, he might start by saying, don't do that. This is wrong. Here he says, no. Don't be shaken. And it reveals something that Paul understands about our shared faith, and it speaks to his pastoral heart. Because in talking to these brand new Christians, Paul's first priority is not the message, but the effect that the message is having on them. And we can see that anxiety has destabilized them. And he knows that if he doesn't work through that it's going to distort the rest of the message that he has for them. And even how he goes about this is really, really important. And it's important for us to see. Look at the word that he uses. He starts with this. He says, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him. He chooses this intentionally. Right from the get-go, Paul is reframing everything. He's using this as a foundational statement about the shared hope that they have in Jesus Christ. He doesn't start with the controversy. There is a controversy that he's going to address, but he starts with the assurance. This is our hope, and he's rooting everything in that. And I'm going to come back to that later, but I don't want to miss that because all too often when we are encountering a message that's confusing or misleading or it's unclear or we don't know where the source is, right? We can be very quick to enter into the controversy. And if we're not rooted in the assurance first, that will often create confusion for us. And so it's only after he's recentered them on the shared hope that we have in Jesus Christ that he names the sources of the issue. He's laying a foundation for everything else that he's going to say in this whole section of the text. Everything that we're going to look at this week and next, right here. And so before Paul explains what hasn't happened, what's going to happen, or how evil is held back, he slows them down. Takes that pastoral pause to name what's happening internally. And he lays a foundation for them for that's rooted in the truth. He does one of the most pastoral things possible. And it's something that I need to hear, something we all need to hear. Don't be shaken. Check it out. Again, end of verse 1 and verse 2. It says, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by the teaching allegedly from us, whether by a prophecy or by word of mouth or by letter, asserting that the day of the Lord has already come. Did you notice he doesn't just say, calm down? I have learned from personal experience that saying that does not go well. And so he lists some sources. He names the cause of their panic. He lists prophecy, teaching, letters. These things allegedly done in our name. He pluralizes the danger, and rather than picking on one bad actor, and he points out that in these moments, there's often multiple attack vectors that allow fear to come in. See, after the pastoral pause, he confronts the issue and the lie itself. And the lie wasn't Jesus isn't coming. The lie was he's already here and you missed it. Judgment has started. You're on the wrong side. It's a lie that's meant to destabilize this church. It's a lie that's meant to paralyze them through fear. I really want you to sit in their shoes for a second, right? This is early days, early church, baby Christians, right? Imagine how it would strip away your hope to think we've missed the gospel, we've messed it up, right? Imagine how it would turn you away from God because you think you're on the wrong side now, that you don't understand it all of a sudden. And then these people that are perpetrating this lie are positioned perfectly to step in and to rescue them, to lead them. Don't worry, we've got it under control. We'll help you. It's a lie that we deal with today. There are people who will gladly swoop in to solve all of your problems, ignoring the fact that they're the ones who created the problem in the first place. They create false urgency. The reason the Theselonians were so vulnerable to this deception wasn't just because it sounded spiritual. It did sound spiritual. It wasn't just that, though. It was that it was coming through prophecy and teaching and letters, and it felt so urgent. And the principle here that we need to really wrap our heads and our hearts around is that false urgency is the enemy of spiritual maturity. Think about that. Think about how decisions work in our own lives. Whether it's spiritual decisions or not, when do you make your worst decisions? When do you say the things that you regret? When do you click the link that you wish you shouldn't, or that you know you shouldn't, right? When do you do the things that you know you shouldn't? It's almost always when there's a pressure to do something, when it feels urgent, I have to act now, I have to do this. Like advertising and branding and all this praise on this, right? Don't miss it, right? We all know about fear of missing out, right? This is exactly how it works. When there's a pressure to do something right then, when we create that false urgency. And Tim Keller used to preach on this all the time. He said, fear-driven thinking actually lowers our resistance to error. When anxiety is in the driver's seat, almost anything can sound convincing. When we're in a panic, we stop consulting community. We stop praying for wisdom. We stop looking at the long track record of God's faithfulness in our lives. We just react. And that's exactly what was happening here in Thessalonica. This rumor that the day of the Lord has come, it has created a pressure cooker, and it was bypassing everything that they knew, and it skipped their wisdom and triggered their fears. And so how does Paul diffuse it? Well, let's look at verses 3 and 4 quickly here. We're not going to get into it too much today. We're going to do this more next week, but it says this: don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Like I said, we're going to do a deeper dive into these verses next week in our second sermon on this section of the text. But Paul is essentially saying, look at the evidence. He tells them, don't let anyone deceive you in any way. He actually kind of gives them a bit of a checklist. He says, remember, this has to happen and that has to happen. He points to rebellion. He points to this figure of lawlessness. And essentially he's saying, right, I know what you've been told. I know what you've read. I know the prophecies that you've heard. I know what you've been taught. But does this really look like Christ has fully established his kingdom? No? Then stop letting people tell you that you missed it. And I think oftentimes we need this kind of reality check just as much as they did. You and I live in an economy of attention. And honestly, I don't know if there's anything that grabs our attention better than a catastrophe. It's like you can't look away from the train wreck. It's happening in slow motion, right? If you scroll through YouTube, if you spend time on TikTok, right, the algorithm will feed you an endless stream of Christian clickbait. There's always a new date. There's always another September 25th or solar eclipse or Antichrist figure or global event that someone will tell you, this is it. This is the get the signboards, get the bell, right? Time to tell, the end is nigh, right? And as the church, you and I can fall into one of two traps here. One, we can very easily become obsessed with this stuff. We start seeing end-time signs in every single headline, in every bad news story that breaks, right? The other thing is that we can become very fearful. Right? We doom scroll and we listen to talking heads predict the end, and even if we're skeptical, even if we're rational human beings, there is that part of our brain that goes, what if he's right this time? What if this is it? And that fear itself can masquerade as spiritual because it often, and they know they're doing this, it often borrows religious language. And so Paul cuts through all the noise. He says, compare the hype against the word. Does it match the checklist? No? Don't need to panic. Pump the brakes. And now I know in our world today that there's often, there may even be some pushback here about it. There are sincere believers that would say, yeah, it does match up, right? Are you reading the same things I'm reading, right? Like, look at the culture, look at the laws changing, look at the hostility towards faith. Surely this is the rebellion that Paul is talking about. But I think we need to pause and have a little theological humility here. We are closer to the end than ever before. But at the same time, Christians have been saying, this is it, for 2,000 years. Every generation has looked at their own crisis, whether it was the fall of Rome, or Attila the Hun, or the Black Plague, or the World Wars, or the Cold War, and the risk of nuclear holocaust, right? And we've been convinced we're seeing the end. And Paul is pushing back on that and asking us to be a little more precise than temporal pain. He's not saying the end isn't coming. He's not saying Jesus isn't coming, right? He's saying, look at the text, because we're not talking about a general decline in morals. We're not talking about a culture that doesn't like Christians. There have been lots of cultures that don't like Christians. He's describing a very specific, unmistakable event that the Theselonians have been worked up into a frenzy, into a panic over, and they were convinced that they've missed. He writes about this man of lawlessness who doesn't just oppose God, but who actually sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. And Paul is saying, has a figure appeared who has successfully seized the global worship of humanity and seated himself in the temple of God? And if the answer is no, and to the church in Thessalonica it was, then it means the day of the Lord has not come. It's not that it's not coming, but it hasn't come yet. And I'm so glad he says this stuff, because it should free us from the panic of the moments that we find ourselves in. It should remind us that God has a timeline, and he's not just along for the ride. And so rather than giving them a bunch of new information, in the face of this fear, of this panic, Paul points them back to established facts. Take a look at verse 5 with me, because this is, for this first part of the passage, the pivot point for the whole thing. It says, don't you remember that when I was with you, I used to tell you these things? Don't you remember? I love that. Don't you remember? Paul's not shaming them. He's not saying, guys, can't believe you fell for that. Like, duh. He says, take a deep breath. You know this. He re-anchors them. That brings me to the next insight here, and that's that stability comes from remembering, not from chasing. The Theselonians had started to think that they needed a new revelation. They needed a fresh word, the latest prophecy. And Paul says, no, you don't need something new. You need to remember what's true. John Byron gave this great quote where he talks about this. He says, it's never easy to wait. But usually we can be patient because we know that the when we're waiting for will soon be the now that we can enjoy. But it's harder to wait when there is no clear end in sight. When you don't know at what point, when, will become now. This is particularly true in the life and the ministry of the church. Paul recognized this 2,000 years ago. He knew that if the church was constantly in a hurry, that if we were running from one rumor to the next, constantly scanning the horizon for signs of the end, we would never be able to live faithfully in the present because we were so obsessed from turning when into now. And so Paul's play, and ours too, when we feel this, when we get caught up in the moment, is to slow down. He says, remember what I told you when I was there. God is sovereign. Evil is real, but it's on a leash. Jesus is coming back. And when he comes back, it's not going to be some secret that you have to decode. Paul's solution to their anxiety wasn't a complex chart of the end times. It was a call to remember the gospel that they had already received. And I think that's the call for us too. When the headlines are screaming, when the algorithm feeds you all the anxiety you can handle, when the pulse is pounding between our ears and we feel like we don't know what's going on, the answer is rarely to find more information. The answer is to stop, to take a breath, to remember what we already know to be true about who Jesus is. If I can confess to you, I had to stop this myself this week. I was getting so wrapped up in the news cycle about what's going on in the world. Something to do with some neighbor of ours to the south. And I could feel my anxiety growing. You know that physical feeling when you get anxious? Like you get that heat, and you can't get up the back of your neck, you can't get comfortable, right? Like you feel twitchy. And the more it grew, the more I craved information to try to stamp down the feeling that I had. And I realized something in that moment. I wasn't looking for God. I was looking for control. I never would have put those words to it. Not in the moment, anyways. It wasn't what I set out to do. But I realized I was chasing that sense of control that I'd felt that I'd lost. You know, if I just read one more article, if I just watch one more video, it'll all make sense. I'll feel safe. That's the trap. In moments like that, information might answer a question, but it will rarely solve a problem. And it usually ends up feeding the panic. There's only one truth. One. That can ultimately steady us. So how do we break the cycle? Well, Paul's words to the church in Thessalonica invite us to join in three very concrete practices that can actually help us to stand firm when the world starts to shake. And the first is this. 1, refuse panic as a spiritual guide. We need to recognize that there are moments for urgency. There are moments when it's necessary to move quickly. Sometimes. Most of the time it's not. What's actually urgent today is that we make a critical decision that before the next crisis hits, that before we hear the next convincing argument that the end is nigh, that before we run the risk of being swayed by false teaching that tries to bend the truth to its own ends, that we will not allow panic to become our spiritual guide. Panic is not a fruit of the Spirit. When we allow that false sense of urgency to take a hold of our lives, it doesn't just make us anxious. It distracts us from being faithfully obedient to God in the moment that we find ourselves in right now. When we get worried about making now, we stop living in the now that He's placed us in. And we get so focused on the end. The enemy doesn't need to make us stop believing. He didn't stop the Theselonians from believing. He just stopped them temporarily from living faithfully in the moment. And so the next time we feel that frantic urgency, that pressure to react, that scary video and share it, right? To spiral into what ifs, We need to treat that like a warning light on the dashboard of our lives. It's not a warning that the world is ending. It's a warning that we might be drifting from trust into fear. We need to recognize that not every urgent voice deserves our immediate attention or our trust. Second thing we can do, second practice we can put into place is to return to what we already know. I've noticed something over the last 20 years, you might have as well. It's that culture is just catching up, actually. Christians started talking about social media fasts like 20 years ago. Anyone ever taken a social media fast where you drop it, maybe for Lent or anything? No, one person. Yikes. Oh, two, thank you. Huh. All right, there's hope. The broader culture started to adopt this language, and you started hearing about things like digital detoxes, right, or attention hijacking. There are people actually who worked at Google and Meta and whatnot who actually helped build these platforms, and they've actually come out now and they're talking about what the constant input is doing to our minds and to our hearts. In fact, there is actually a generation right now, my kids' generation, that are, a lot of them are talking about stepping back and soft quitting TikTok and other platforms because they can feel the effect that it's having on their minds and their hearts. And it's interesting because over and over again now, we're recognizing the harm that these little glowing rectangles can do to us. And so before we go looking for another explanation on YouTube, or on some other thing, right? Before we find hope in an influencer, let's go back to what we know in Scripture. When we feel shaken in our lives, what's our play? Because it's not Mr. Beast, right? Go to Psalm 46. God is our refuge and our strength. When we feel alone, it's not to engage with some distant digital community that pretends to offer you friendship. It's to read Matthew 28 and to recognize that God says, I am with you always until the very end of the age. We need to remind ourselves of the end of the story. And if the new truth that we're reading about, the thing that we're scrolling through, this thing that we're reading, right? If that contradicts what God says in His Word or what we know about the character of the God that we love, then we need to ditch it, throw it out, get rid of it. I'm not saying information is evil. I love to learn. That's half my problem. But I do think we would probably all be a lot healthier if we spent more time remembering and less time researching. And then the third thing that I think we can actually put into place is to practice discernment in community. Have you ever noticed that fear thrives in isolation? Our natural instinct, what's very common for a lot of us, is the tendency to withdraw. You know, we do the whole turtle shell thing, right? Like, you know, or just retreat. We retreat to the safety of something that we think we can control. But Paul is writing this letter to a church, plural. Remember how he starts verse 1? We ask you, brothers and sisters, if you're worried about something, if you're dealing with some anxiety, if there's stress or fear or something that's causing an unsettled feeling inside of you, don't carry it alone. Go to a trusted believer. Say, hey, I'm reading this thing, right? Or I saw this video. Have you seen it? It's bothering me. Does that sound like Jesus to you? Oftentimes I have found in my own life, if I just say it out loud, if I just say it to another believer, it almost strips it of its power because it sounds ridiculous in my voice, you know, when I say it out loud. Now, we've just scratched the surface of this, and we're going to go so much deeper next week when we look at this man of lawlessness and the restraining of evil. But I felt we really had to root ourselves in Paul's wisdom before we confront some of the harder parts of the next section. We need to understand that we need to refuse panic as a spiritual guide, that we have to return to what we know, that we must practice discernment in community. And so we're going to press the pause button on this chapter for this week. And when we come back next week, and please come back next week, because I'm going to walk through this text again and look directly at those difficult verses about the man of lawlessness. We're going to see what it is, what is this mystery of how God is currently restraining evil in our world. But as you go out today, I want you to hold on to this. The Theselonians were scared because they thought that they'd missed God. They thought the clock had run out. They thought that the timeline had moved on without them, that they were left behind. But Paul says to them, and he's saying to us, you're not late. God is never rushed. He's never taken by surprise. He's not just along for the ride. And you and I don't need more predictions. We don't need to try to figure out a date on a calendar. It's futile to try anyways. It says so in God's word. And so as we look at the week ahead, when the world starts to shake us and the fears threaten to overtake us, rather than grasping at a sense of control, let's stand firm, not because we figured it all out, but because we know the King and we trust his truth. We're going to transition into communion now, but let's pray.